Today we're going to be looking at Brazil. We have just finished a section on Mexico, race, and the modern nation. Today we're shifting to South America where we're looking at Brazil, race, and the modern nation. We are going to continue to look at a phenomenon called indigenismo, or indigenism, which was a trend throughout Latin America as nations turned away from their colonial personalities into an image or the desire to create a new image for their modern selves. We'll see this manifest through social, political, and economic means, but particularly, of course, we're honing in on the art and architecture of the period and the way that it reflects and shapes current thought. So take a minute with this image. I suggest you pause the video, really look at what's happening here. Send me your reflections. Now that you've done that, what we're looking at is a painting created in 1922, which was the year of the celebration of the centennial anniversary of Brazilian independence. So Brazil was colonized by the Portuguese, as we know, in 1822. That changed. And this painting is trying to depict exactly how that change took place. The painting is called The First Session of the Council of the State. And it was one of those pivotal, important paintings painted in the image of nostalgia, right? We've got this warm glow and coloration from the light coming in the window. Most of the setting has this lush pastel, coral, and pink, a very soft, inviting set of colors. The Impressionist way of painting, the way of emphasizing light, really gives us this vision of hope, of brightness, and even of enlightenment. What we're seeing in terms of the figures, on the left is Princess Leopoldina, wife to Prince Pedro, and she's depicted here discussing with José Bonifácio de Andrade, who's the patriarch of Brazilian independence, how best to advise Prince Pedro on the question of the nation's independence from Portugal. The painting documents this quiet, interior moment that led up to Prince Pedro's cry of independence. It's stripped of any disagreement. There's nothing violent about this painting. It's actually a fascinating representation of the moment right before Brazil declares it is no longer a Portuguese territory. It's nothing like we saw with the Mexican Revolution. Those paintings that we saw from Rivera, from Kahlo, from the other muralists, they were active, even violent, painful expressions of this longing and force in dislodging Mexico from its colonial ties to Spain. None of that comes up here. These people could be having tea together in the parlor, right? It's a bizarre way to think about that moment before independence. And what Georgina de Albuquerque is trying to say is that independence in Brazil, or at least the memory of the moment of independence in Brazil, turned on evolution rather than rupture. It happened as a quiet, considered decision. That's how it's portrayed, at least, in this painting. And that's how it was celebrated throughout Brazil during the centennial. 1922, again 100 years after independence from Portugal, Brazil creates an international exhibition commemorating that independence in Rio de Janeiro. What you're seeing here is an archival image, which is why it doesn't have the highest resolution, of the spot where the centennial was held. These buildings were constructed for the purpose of the centennial celebration. They were really built seemingly ex nihilo. This land didn't exist prior to the decision to create this as a centennial plot. This was part of the ocean. So through a process of damming and landfill, the site is created as if out of nothing, and that as if is very important here. This is an overview of that site. You can see sort of the man-made borders here in the lower part of the image. And then just look at that architecture. These highly geometrically aligned buildings placed on this new peninsula reaching out into the ocean. It's a wild juxtaposition of nature and a very particular type of culture. Let's look at the architecture in a little more detail for this centennial. Okay, what do you see? Really think about the symbolism here. If I asked you where this building came from, where would you tell me? Does this look like Brazil? Does it look like even a stereotypical image of Brazil? Or does it look like a stereotypical image of elsewhere? What we're seeing here is a Republican oligarchy. And Republican is something slightly different in Brazil than it is here, but we can think of it as the traditionalists who are trying to reinforce an idea of domestication, of national development, and a very particular type, right? This building is so crazy European. It's eclectic. There's a lot of things going on here that we might not see, say, in France in particular, or in Spain in particular, or in Portugal in particular. There is a mishmash on the building, but we've got these classical Greco-Roman columns. We have a series of triumphal arches that mark the entrance. Each part of the building draws from a particular region, but wildly, it doesn't draw from Brazil. This is the centennial building commemorating independence, celebrating independence from Europe. And they couldn't have picked a more European style building to do that work. Other architecture that was built for the centennial looked a bit like this. Again, this is a very eclectic building. It draws on many things, but so much of this draws on Portuguese architecture. If you went to parts of Portugal, you could find all of the elements in this building. Such a weird choice for a centennial celebrating independence from Portugal. Why would you mimic their buildings? What are the centennial hosts trying to say with these choices? Here we are in the bay that was created. We're looking at the buildings chosen for the centennial. Across the water, you can see some of those Portuguese-inspired buildings. You can begin to see the centennial building a little to the left of center in the image with its large columns. And we also see a plane that's landing on the water. One that's close to the dock, another in the middle of this bay. What's projected is an image of futurity, of innovation. It's 1922. Planes are absolutely novel. This would have been the height of technological progress. And that's what this exhibition is trying to show. The evolution of Brazil from what it was, and we'll get to what they thought it was, to this new, very European, tech-savvy nation. Or at least industrialized nation is probably the more historically accurate way to frame that. That Centennial exhibition wasn't the first time that this sort of creation of a landmass and reproduction of European architecture happened in Brazil. Here I'm showing you the 1908 Agriculture and Science Fair set of pavilions right next to this incredible rock formation, which is known as the Morro do Castelo, which is just the mountain, the castle mountain in a way. In order to create the 1922 exhibition, that mountain was leveled. It was completely flattened. The ramifications of this are enormous. Let's take a look. I've circled here on the image the space where that mountain once stood. All of that territory, all of that construction, development, housing, governmental buildings, all of those were created after that mountain was leveled. And okay, fine, we move Earth around all the time. It's part of our anthropocentric way of doing things, right? We reform the Earth, we terraform in a sense, in order to make things as we would like them to be. But this goes beyond that. This is not just ecological damage that was done. The reason being that the people who lived on the Morro do Castelo, and here we see it partially exploded. The people who lived in that Morro do Castelo region were the people of color in Rio. These were Black neighborhoods going back for centuries. These were indigenous people who had built modern home, modern community in this neighborhood. Once you know who lived there and that particular place was chosen for removal in order to build that shiny new pavilion that was supposed to reflect the brand new image of Brazil, we can see that something else, something far more sinister, something white supremacist was happening. The city of Rio was diagnosed by one of the physicians at the time of in the early 1900s. In the early 20th century. So 1900 to 1922 is what we're thinking about. And the diagnosis was that Rio, this beautiful woman, as the physician described the city, was sick. She was ailing. She had been infected, in a sense. She'd been infected by those that were considered immigrants, outsiders, people who had lived in Brazil for as long as that physician who made this diagnosis had. The diagnosis itself was this not very covert, racist way of saying that Rio had become sick because of all of the non-European citizens who lived there. Again, remember, this is celebrating the independence of Brazil from Portugal. Portugal would have been the source of those Europeans who lived in the city. It would have been the colonizers that they're talking about. Those were not the original inhabitants. Those black communities, those indigenous Brazilian communities, their roots went as far back as any of the Europeans, if not much, much farther. Here you can see the destruction of their churches, their homes, all of this to create a healthy Rio, right? Following that horrifying analogy. The idea was to create a healthy Rio, to cut out the disease from the city's foundation. It's horrifying to think about that way. It's so explicit, this racism, this white supremacy, and that way of thinking is what is shaping the redevelopment of the city in the interest of projecting a new and modern Brazil. The centennial was celebrated in a myriad of different ways. Festivals, exhibitions, all sorts of public speeches, songs, dances. It was a citywide celebration in Rio. It's a nationwide celebration, in fact. One of the ways that the vision for this modern, independent Brazil was projected was through some of the catalogs, some of the visual imagery that was created just to inform people about what was available to them during this festival season. And of course, with that catalog, there were ads. And that's what we're looking at here. We're looking at an ad for a shoe factory. The shoes, you see them in the bottom third of the image over to the left. Take a few minutes, pause this, tell me what you see. So just at the outset, right, we have these two women over to the right, bare-breasted. The second one with long, flowing drapery. Both painted, illustrated in this highly European fashion. And we've seen this again and again. At this point, I'm sure you're over it. You're like, of course, they're going to make it look like Europe. From our point of view, it seems silly. And it's not only silly, it's just like so predictable and ridiculous. But here it is again, right? We have these Greco-Roman women with their victory leaves, very much like we saw the Angel of Independence, the top of that tall column in the center of Mexico City. We have these winged cherubs, this imagery that comes from a sort of kitschy way of thinking about religion, Catholicism in particular here in Portugal. And then we have these neo-colonial buildings in the background, which is the shoe factory, of course. Nowhere here are the people who work in that factory represented. Nowhere here are the majority of Brazilians even represented. We just have this bizarre Greco-Roman thing. Again, celebrating the independence of Brazil from Europe. So what's happening? If we explore this imagery in detail, throughout the whole catalog in which this was placed, there was an overwhelming demonstration of a new alliance between beauty, health, tropicality, and modernization. That the elite in Brazil, and by the elite I just mean like the wealthy and privileged. It's an uncomfortable term, the elite, but the wealthy and privileged, they adopted this set of tropes really to represent themselves and their new nation as they saw it. In most publicity materials for companies and products, white men, white women, children of classical Greco-Roman appearance, wearing white robes and crowns and these flowing garments, were arranged in this gorgeous green Brazilian tropical landscape, or they were used to frame the architecture and machinery of modern factories. Behind all of this was a social and pseudoscientific development in eugenics. Eugenics is this attempt to improve the human race, and improve is with absolute scare quotes. It's really an attempt to whiten the human race through a series of different mechanisms. The mechanism that eugenics really took on in Brazil and throughout much of Latin America in particular was the idea that through architecture, one could transform the living habits of the humans within. So architecture becomes this sort of prosthetic, a limb, a mode of creating what was known as social hygiene, like a cleansed, just think about the overtones of this, right? Human cleansing, it's horrifying. But that's the background here, and it was absolutely embraced. School children, particularly girls, took classes in eugenics. They took classes on how to improve their own prospects for ever whiter children. It's just widespread, and this is, of course, in the run-up to World War II. So that idea of racial purification that we see just in one of its most horrific forms in Nazi Germany, that same ideology is taking place here in Brazil, in much of the Americas, in many places around the globe, in fact. I'm going to stop this section. I'm going to post a video for you. The video is going to be on the avant-garde. Because while we have this highly traditionalist view of what Brazil should be, according to the minds of the white, wealthy, and privileged, there is another side to this. There are many other sides to this. And the avant-garde, this particular group of artists, were trying to show something very different than the images celebrated, the architecture celebrated in this bizarre centennial.